This is Chapter 1, The Nature and Tools of Research. Before we get started, I just want to point out that we're using the text Practical Research, Planning and Design by Paul Leedy and Ch1 Ellis Ormond. So just also make sure that you have the 11th edition of this text, as it will make a difference as we move along. All right, Chapter 1. Research. So here's where we start to distinguish between what is commonly perceived as research and what we're referring to in this course. Research, as defined in this course, is a systematic process of collecting, analyzing, and interpreting information, essentially our data. So we collect data or collect information from, in this area of research, we're collecting from participants, human participants, and we collect information either in the form of words, which we'll talk about as being qualitative data, or in the form of some way in which we can place a numeric value, quantitative data, and then we interpret that data. We analyze and interpret. So collect, analyze, and interpret that data. The goal here is to increase our understanding of some phenomenon about which we are concerned or interested. So there are tons of different areas of research that we can participate in, and one of the things that I want you to think about for this course as we move along is that in your assignments, you have 3 assignments, you will be proposing your own research study. And so the first step is deciding, what am I interested in? What do I want to look into? So here's a good time to start thinking about what are some topics. What is your area of expertise, your discipline, and then within that discipline, what are some topics that we might want to study? And in doing those 2 things, you can then narrow down a topic of interest, and we'll talk about that more as the semester goes on, and you'll have opportunities to ask me questions as well. Here's where we tried to dispel some of the myths about what research is. Research is not just gathering information. We have a very systematic approach that we engage in to collect data. It's not just gathering random information, but there's a systematic way in which we do so. It's not just rummaging around for hard to locate information or transporting facts from one location to another. Here is the research cycle, and this is also on page 3 of your textbook if you want to follow along. And this is something that you're going to all be participating in. You will begin with a research problem, an unanswered question. The researcher clearly and specifically articulates the goal of the research endeavor. The researcher then divides the principal problem into manageable subproblems. The researcher identifies hypotheses and assumptions that underlie the research effort. The researcher develops a specific plan for addressing the problem and its subproblems. The researcher then collects, organizes, and analyzes data related to the problems and its subproblems. And the researcher interprets the meaning of the data as they relate to the problem and its subproblems. Okay, so what does this all mean? The reason that I really love this particular diagram, and I think it really illustrates the nature of the research process, is that it is a cyclical process. We often think of research studies in isolation, and that's a mistake, especially with where we are currently with our wealth of knowledge. Researchers are not working in isolation. And one of the things that you will be doing as well as you develop your own research study proposal is that you will be beginning with what is already known, aka your literature review. You will begin with a review of the literature in your discipline, and your discipline may be broad. So let's say you're in special education administration. Well, special education's broad, special education administration, narrowing it in. And now within special education administration, for example, what may be interested in? Or, educational psychology. Within educational psychology, there are many subtopics. Maybe you're interested specifically in motivation, more specifically, motivation of whom and for what. Maybe I'll say motivation of college students, for what? Maybe for, their motivation for grades or for mastery of the content. And so I can keep narrowing down. So I begin with a broader area of research that I'm interested in, my discipline, and then narrow it down into more manageable chunks and topics that I might be interested in actually pursuing. Now, as we start moving ahead and planning, and in each lesson we'll also refer to your assignments that are coming up. And one of the things that you might want to start thinking about is if you are going to conduct a thesis or research project, which that may apply to some of you, although I know it does not apply to all of you, this is a point where you may start thinking about what is it that I want to do for my thesis or my dissertation. And this can be a great opportunity, and I can walk you through it more individually as needed as well. I'd be happy to do so, is to start thinking about what might I want to study for my own project, and then start proposing it here, and then that might be a springboard for some of the work that you do later on. For those of you for whom you do not need to complete a thesis research project or dissertation, this may be an area where you can better understand the research process so that when you are a consumer of research, you understand from where this information, how it's developed, how it's evolved, and how it's come to being. And that will help you understand the research articles that you read better, and hopefully better interpretation and then application in whatever work setting, whether it's a school or you're working in a treatment facility, whatever area that you end up working in. There's research that stems from maybe some of the practices that you're engaging in. You can learn more about that through a good literature review. Okay, so again, why is this diagram so important? Research is a cyclical process. We begin with the wealth of knowledge that is already known. We then we then do our thorough research of the literature. That's our literature review. We narrow it down, always keeping in mind who it is we're studying and what it is we're studying. So an example I gave earlier of motivation, student motivation, and then I specifically targeted college students. Well, that research study is going to look very different than if I had targeted elementary school children or middle school children or high school students. So each of those projects, although they're all targeting motivation, we can even be more specific for math, right? It's going to look very different if you're looking at research targeting elementary school kids versus middle school versus high school versus college, etc. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind not only is your topic, but who is it that you're studying? Who's your population of interest? And then, so that's where the research, addressing those sub-problems, becoming more specific. And then your research, upon its completion, after you've collected your data, you've analyzed your data, interpreted your data, then you then publish that data, and that becomes part of the body, the wealth of knowledge that other researchers can then go and explore and study from and learn from, build upon through replication, or it contributes to their literature reviews. So it's a cyclical process. Research is not done in isolation. Okay, so here are the steps. So earlier I said there's a systematic approach to which we conduct research. It's not just, gathering information, finding people's opinions, but there is a systematic process that we take. So the step one is identify a question or a problem, articulate a goal. So what is the goal of your study? Divide the principal problem into more manageable subproblems. Identify the hypotheses, which we talked about in that diagram. Develop a plan. What is your methodology? What is your design? We'll talk more about that over the course of the semester. Collect, organize, and analyze the data and interpret the data as they relate to the problem. And interpreting the data, I think, is one of the most enjoyable aspects of research, because once you finally collected this data, analyzed the data, now we can say, what does this mean? What are the implications of this study for not only practice, but future research? And that's the process of interpretation for your theses and dissertations, or even in reading research articles. That's a discussion section where we can, we have a results section, we have the different parts of the research paper. This is the part of the research paper where we get to actually interpret what it means, put our own take on it. We have the data, we have the analysis. Now, how does that change how we apply this information? Okay, so one of the parts that you will have to develop is how to develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a logical supposition, a reasonable guess, an educated conjecture. We are hypothesizing the nature of the world in this particular area. So for example, we I'd like to, at this point, break it down into two types of hypotheses. You have the hypotheses looking at differences and the hypotheses looking at relationships. Let me explain. So when we're looking at differences, we might say, what is the difference in mastery orientation between males and females? That is a hypothesis. That's a research question that we're looking at. What is the difference in mastery orientations between males and females? If I turn that into hypothesis, I turn it into a statement. I can either say one is greater than the other, or I can say they differ. So for example, I can say males and females differ in their mastery orientation. That would be a hypothesis. I can say one is greater than the other. So let's say I have literature to support that, males' mastery orientations are greater than females. I would say males' mastery orientations are greater than females. That would be a hypothesis. The hypothesis provides a tentative explanation for the phenomenon under investigation. And it may direct thinking to possible sources of information necessary to resolve the research problem and its subproblems. On the flip side, I can also develop a hypothesis looking at a relationship between variables. So let's say I can say there is a relationship between mastery, orientation, and motivation. So I can say there's a relationship between them. So my hypothesis will be there's a relationship between mastery and motivation. I can also specify what we call a directional hypothesis and say higher levels of mastery will relate to higher levels of motivation. Now, in the same way, I could have said the reverse. I could have said that, as mastery orientation increases, motivation decreases. There could be a relationship, but it could be an inverse relationship. So by specifying that they are both related, and if you've taken stats before, it's called a positive correlation. If I said they're both going in the same direction, in that way I'm stating the direction of the hypothesis. Or if I'm even saying that they're going in opposite directions, an inverse relationship, that's also specifying the direction. We call that directional hypothesis. So the two types, just as a review, the two types of hypotheses, we have hypotheses looking at, and this is kind of an overview. I mean, we can get more specific, especially as you get exposed to more statistics. But right now, just in its general form, you have hypotheses looking at differences and hypotheses looking at relationships. Those are your two types. Within each of those two types, you can have directional, specifying which is greater, or what direction the relationship goes in, or non-directional, which just says there's going to be a difference or there's going to be a relationship, but we don't exactly know what that looks like. It's more of an exploratory hypothesis, we would call it. Assumption. An assumption is a condition that is taken for granted. There are two general assumptions that underlie most research projects. The phenomenon under investigation is somewhat lawful and predictable. Cause and effect relationships can account for certain patterns observed in a phenomenon. So when we're approaching research, the reason in which we can take this systematic approach is because of these assumptions. So researchers assume these two things. That there is a lawful, predictable way in which human behavior is manifested, and because of that, we can then study them in a lawful and predictable way as well. In research, there are several orientations, philosophical orientations. With the natural sciences, the primary approach taken was one based on the philosophical orientation of positivism. With positivism, the appropriate use measurement tools to objectively uncover absolute undeniable truths about cause and effect relationships within the physical world and the human experience. With social scientists, we have the concept that we're dealing with things that may not necessarily be directly quantifiable. For example, in the natural sciences, maybe we're measuring weight, pounds, length, inches of growth. It's more objective. And so the post-positivism is a philosophical orientation that most social sciences have taken on. It's a little bit more tentative, and its true objectivity in seeking absolute truths can be slightly elusive goals. So it's taking into account that there's some subjectivity at play, and we need to make a conscious effort to systematize and operationalize all of our variables so that there's understanding between researchers of what it is that we are measuring. Two other philosophical orientations toward research are constructivism. Constructivism, you're looking at no absolute truth. The realities researchers identify are simply perceptions and interpretations. It means that they're constructing knowledge, but that construction of knowledge, of course, is going to take into account their own biases, which then impact our interpretations. Our interpretations, although the analyses might be objective, the interpretations or even our measurement tools may be somewhat subjective, so taking that into account. And pragmatism and realism are looking at, well, absolute truths may actually exist, but also human beings' self-constructed beliefs about phenomena are legitimate as well in their own right. So it's taking into account both of these perspectives into a more balanced whole. Tools of research. Here are specific mechanisms or strategies used to collect, manipulate, or interpret data. So the first one that you're going to be utilizing as well is the library and its resources. You will be utilizing the databases found in our library system, and you will be conducting a literature review in your discipline area, narrowing down your topic. Computer technology is also used. I'm sure some of you, if not most of you, have participated in some type of computer research, maybe a SurveyMonkey or some other such tool. We need to take into account measurement. How are we going to measure our variables? One concept that I referred to briefly was that of an operational definition. And that is looking at, well, what is the variable of measurement? Well, we're interested in measuring depression. Well, depression is somewhat abstract. It's not directly measurable. So we need to do two things, which is operationalize it, which is first defining it. How do we define depression? If you look at different sources, there might be some patterns that we see across all of them, but they might vary slightly. So one is, how do they measure them, and the second aspect would be how do they define them, and then how do they measure them. So operational definitions, in this case measurement, take into account definition as well as measurement. So measurement takes into account that operational definition doing both. Statistics, there's a whole other course on how to actually analyze your statistics, the language, looking at the language in which you use to communicate your findings, interpretations of findings, etc., and then the human mind, of course, to your cognitive capacity to do so, to study this and to then utilize that language to express it to others. Now, we, throughout the course of the semester, will talk about different methodologies utilized in different types of research studies, different topic areas, lean themselves more to one methodology versus another. So looking at our methodology will dictate the types of tools that the researcher will then utilize. And again, we're just exposing you here to the overarching picture of the research process, and then we'll get in more depth as we go along in the semester. Okay, the library and its resources. We will primarily be utilizing the research databases to find peer-reviewed research articles. A peer-reviewed research article is one that is acknowledged in the field, reviewed by their peers, and there are certain seminal journals that you would want to pay attention to. If you are unsure about the premier journals in your field, one of the best ways that you can begin this process is to simply contact your advisor and say, okay, I'm in the Department of Drug and Alcohol Abuse Studies. What are the seminal premier journals in this field or in special education or educational psychology? So if you know of them already, you can go ahead and begin your search. If you don't, you may want to ask your advisor. That might be a good starting point. They can give you kind of some tips. These are some reputable journals that you may want to tap into, and then begin your search that way. So that is the primary library source that we will utilize, although the library has many resources that I'm sure you all are aware of. Computer technology, of course, is just, just acknowledging that we utilize computer technology to analyze our data, collect our data, whether or not you're collecting it directly through a computer system or paper pencil that has been inputted into a computer system, utilizing Excel, finding the literature, again, utilizing the library source through computer technology, networking with others, how you store and analyze your data, writing, editing, everything is done in computer. These days, even presenting results, creating your PowerPoint presentation, creating your papers, etc. Measurement, usually used in quantitative research, more difficult for qualitative research. Again, quantitative research is referring to those that can be directly measurable or that we have found a way to measure them through an operational definition and valid and reliable measurement tool, which we can talk more about later. A little bit more difficult to measure in qualitative research, although we do have 2 courses in our department that go through an exhaustive process on the qualitative research process. There are 2 orientations, you may say. Some will say, well, we can attach numbers to and kind of code our qualitative data. Some have more of a pure qualitative approach. We want to have quotes, etc. But like I said, we have 2 whole courses, not just one, that go into that in much more depth. Some common instruments are scales. Here, we're not just talking about scales like to measure weight, but scales like a depression scale, an inventory, an anxiety scale, a motivation scale. We can also utilize, actual scales in terms of measuring weight, if that's of interest to us. In the social sciences, it's not as common. Stopwatches, how quickly they accomplish a task, for example. More specialized instruments, telescope, MRI, again, might not apply to the social sciences, but we can think of things such as EEG, looking at brain activity, what parts of the brain are stimulated with different activities, etc. Statistics, again, whole series of courses on statistics. I'm sure you'll at least take one of them in your graduate career. The main function of statistics are to do 2 things. First, they describe it. So we have a whole body of statistics called descriptive statistics. They summarize the general nature of data obtained. Descriptive statistics are like mean, standard deviations, mode, our most commonly occurring score. That type of data would be in the body of descriptive statistics. And then we also have a whole body of inferential statistics, such as, for some of you may be familiar with some of them, such as t-tests, f-tests, ANOVAs. Those are all types of inferential statistics in which we can infer and really test our hypotheses to make decisions about what our data mean. Language is also a tool. Again, it allows us to communicate and think more effectively. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to take into account what's called the principle of parsimony. Keep it simple. Simplicity is the key here. We want to keep our explanation simple. Sometimes you'll have these really elaborate and wanting to be sophisticated types of interpretations. It just adds more complexity. Keep it simple as possible. It's called the principle of parsimony. Keep it parsimonious. And we want to make sure that we are communicating in a way that is comprehensible to our audience, and keeping it simple ensures that we'll be able to do that. So always think about the simplicity of language. Don't try to be too verbose, too repetitive. Keep it simple. Parsimony is the key. Communicating effectively through writing. This is where quality of writing comes into play. Be precise, be specific, say exactly what you mean. Don't go off into tangents. Keep your primary objective in mind at all times. Provide an overview of what you'll be discussing. So this is all talking about writing style, right? So there is a specific way in which we write a research report, especially we'll be utilizing American Psychological Association guidelines, APA guidelines, for the different parts of a research report and what is needed. But you always want to make sure that you're using a systematic approach in your writing, that you're clear and concise, that you are segueing between paragraphs, and that you have a cohesive whole. Another way we can effectively communicate through writing is referring to figures and tables. Sometimes a figure or a table, we can explain what the figure or table is presenting, and then that can also facilitate the understanding of the audience, always keeping the audience in mind. The human mind, the most important toolbox, the most important tool in your toolbox, used for critical thinking, really thinking critically, and this really, one, in formulating your hypotheses, right? But also in interpreting your data, really thinking critically. Why did we find what we found? Why did previous researchers find what they found, and explaining the previous literature, but also explaining your own reasoning. We need to take into account that evaluation takes into account various forms. There's verbal reasoning, argument analysis. We have to take into account what was our decision making in this research study, hypothesis testing, all are terms that you will be utilizing throughout the course of this semester. Now there are also, again, taking into account the human mind, there are two types of logical reasoning. First is deductive logic. Deductive begins with one or more premises or assumptions that you take to be true, and then you generate hypotheses from them. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, begins with an observation, and then you draw conclusions about an entire class of objects or events based on that observation. The scientific method is the systematic process by which we collect and analyze data. It involves actively and intentionally thinking about all aspects of your research process, actively thinking about your hypothesis, actively thinking about your methodology, actively thinking about your measurement, actively thinking about which types of analyses are appropriate, actively thinking about which types of figures, charts would be most appropriate to display your results, actively thinking about your interpretation, your conclusions, and your implications for future research. So there's a lot of actively thinking about every particular process. Theory building, well, why do we conduct research? We're building theories, right? We're building upon the previous research, which facilitates theory building. So it's an organized body of concepts and principles intended to explain a particular phenomenon, and essentially our goal is always to build theory and build off of previous theory and contribute to the body of literature that is already found. Another important aspect, going back to that chart, if you remember that diagram, it's a cyclical process. Well, it's collaboration with others, not just within our discipline, but across discipline whenever possible. So for example, let's say I'm looking at marriage and family therapy. Well, I might want to tap into social work, communications, look at counseling. And so then I look at all these different separate but related areas and collaborate with others, also within our discipline, but also cross-discipline also gives you more of a broad perspective. So I always say, even though we're in the School of Education and one of the databases for the library search that we might use would be ERIC, also go to psych articles, which are psychology, databases, give you social science research from sociology, social work, etc. So always collaborating with others is an important way in which we can contribute to what is already known. Exploring research in your field, this is where we're moving on to your assignment. You want to look at it's called juried, refereed, or how I call peer-reviewed articles. You're looking for peer-reviewed articles that are judged by experts in the field, and they are peer-reviewed in that they are subject to the expertise of others in the field, and that have said, yes, this is aligned with the practices in our field, and it's validated in that way, in that it is a quality report that is appropriate for this field. Non-juried or not peer-reviewed articles appear on the internet and the newspapers, etc. So in your own search, we only want the first category, juried, refereed, or what we call peer-reviewed research articles only. And again, if you don't know what those are in your field, please feel free to ask your advisor and talk to me. But since you come from so many different backgrounds, your advisor might give you the best starting point from which to go. Okay, so this concludes Chapter 1. Since we're finished with Chapter 1, you don't have anything due right now other than your discussion, but I do want you to begin thinking about your written assignment, your graded assignment, which is to think about what are you going to study, or at least what is your research proposal going to be on. Again, we're not going to conduct this study in this class, but it could be something that you might want to conduct for your dissertation. So from this lesson, now you have an idea of the research process. Now it's time to propose a study of your own. If you were to complete a research study, what would you study? Begin with your discipline. So let's say if you're in special education, and then decide on a topic within your discipline to study. And also remember, you said not only to think about the topic, but the population. So remember in the example I gave you, the educational psychology, the discipline, motivation, the topic. But then it did make a difference whether we're looking at elementary school or middle school or high school or college students. So think also about your population of interest. Once you have your topic in mind, begin a library search of peer-reviewed research articles, those refereed research articles. And once you have those, start collecting those. You can always contact me for more information or if you need some more ideas. But you must have a literature review from peer-reviewed research articles only. Now, one of the things I do say is that you might find inspiration from, a New York Times article. That's fine to have inspiration from those sources, but not fine to use those as a basis for your literature review. So I do encourage you to start with, popular media if you would like, just as long as when you're conducting your actual research study, you're not including those in your report. So that's another thing to keep in mind, also a source of inspiration instead of going directly to the library search. It's up to you. Again, some recommended sources. ERIC is a great database for education, psych articles, psych info, and then there are also some sociology research databases that you can utilize. Again, depending on your field, you might want to go in slightly different directions. Your advisor, again, is also a good starting point to know where to search from there. All right, all the best. Let me know if you have any questions. Always feel free to email me.